And yes, good morning. I'm Cynthia Shore, the Executive Director of the Walt Whitman Birthplace Association, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you here this morning to our series, The Legacy of Long Island Peoples. This is our fourth series in a number of six, and today we're very excited to have let's see who we are here, to have Dr. Linford Fisher, an American professor of history at Brown University, with us. So welcome, Dr. Fisher. So happy you can join us. I would like to introduce Sandy. We have Sandy, there we are. Okay, Sandy Brewster, she has been the collaborator of our program this year, and she is an independent historian, a genealogist, a freelance writer, and business owner. She has served in President William Jefferson Clinton's administration as Deputy Director of the Office of Communications, the United States Department of Agriculture. As a member of the Montauk Indian Nation, she is the Executive Director and Government Affairs Officer. Along with Chief Robert Farrow, she is leading the nation through the reinstatement and recognition process by New York State and the U.S. federal government. Sandy has been a wonderful collaborator. She has reached out and found all the speakers in the series that we have this year. This series is sponsored by Humanities New York, and we want to give a shout out to them. It is also funded with funds from the New York State Council of the Arts and the support of Governor and the New York State Legislature, and administered by the Huntington Arts Council. So we appreciate all that New York State is doing for the arts and literature and programming of many nonprofits here in Long Island. I'm very excited to have you here. I will introduce Dr. Linford Fisher, and we will go through the agenda in a few moments. So Dr. Linford Fisher, PhD, is an associate professor of history at Brown University, and he leads a lively discussion today on the relationship between Long Island's original peoples and the missionaries ordained to save their souls. Dr. Fisher is a noted scholar. He received his doctorate from Harvard University in 2008. His essays have appeared in the William and Mary Quarterly, the New England Quarterly, Ethnohistory, the Journal of Social History, Manuscripts, and the Harvard Theological Review. His research has been supported by fellowships and grants from the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Massachusetts Historical Society, the Newberry Library, the American Philosophical Society, the American Antiquarian Society, the Gilder Lehman Institute for American History, Harvard University, and Brown University. We certainly have an illustrious scholar with us today, noted by all his many awards and scholarship, and his current position as professor of history at Brown University. I welcome him here this morning, and let's all have a round of applause for Dr. Fisher and say welcome. Welcome, Dr. Fisher. We're thrilled to have you. And also joining us first will be Sandy Brewster Walker, and she will say a few words about the programming and perhaps more about Dr. Fisher. And here is the agenda. What we're going to do today is have a series overview, and she will speak why the speaker and topic was selected. We will have our guest speaker's presentation and Q&A and closing remarks again by me. And thank you all for joining us. Grab your hot cup of coffee, and let me remind you that recording is in progress, and this session is recorded for our website and for you to come back to, and for others who have missed this morning's presentation. So Sandy, welcome. I turn it over to you.
Thank you. I just wanted to say a few words, and I'll be very brief, about why I selected Linford. I'm going to call him Linford because I consider him a good friend. Linford, for this presentation. He'll talk a little bit about his book, but I've read it at least 3 times. the book. We actually used the book during the book Montauk at Book Club and went through it chapter by chapter. But every time I read it, I read more about our ancestors. So one of the things I've done today is created a couple of slides to make sure some of our ancestors were here. One of the things Linford talks about or has researched is the Montauk's connection to the different missionaries that were down east. But he also talks about, which he'll tell you more about, Azariah, that's his name, Horton, who walks from Jamaica to Montauk, and I think he does about 3 or 4 times in 1741. And that's the section of Linford's book that I keep reading and reading about. I've also went into the online library at Amherst to find out more about Horton, because what he's doing is he's actually telling where the Native American clusters were in 1741 along the shore, the South Shore. And I find every time I read it, I pick up something else and go off, whether it's Paul Cuffee or whoever, and I go off researching it. So, but anyway, getting back to Linford being a friend, I sit on a committee for him up at Brown, and he's just a great person. So what I'd like to do is to introduce you to my friend, Linford Fisher. Are you there, Linford?
I am, yes. I want to make sure that I give appropriate space before I jump in. But thank you so much, Sandy. Is it okay if I share my screen now as well?
Yes, you can share your screen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction and for the opportunity to be here. It's really meaningful and a great privilege to have the chance to share with you and to be a part of these conversations. And it really seems like a lovely series that you're doing overall. And I've just enjoyed the opportunity I've had to work with Sandy and to be an observer and in a small way of a minor participant in sort of the amazing work that she's doing for the Montauk community and you know, trying to get the state to do what they should have done a long time ago, which is to recognize the Montauk Indian Nation and as well as the federal government. And so really do everything I can, which is not that much, to help support that process. It's so important, and it's just so amazing to see all that she has done. So thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the chance to be here. It really is a great privilege. So today, as has already been announced, I want to talk a little bit about Long Island and this history, really in the 18th and early 19th century of indigenous peoples on Long Island, primarily Shinnecock and Montauk, and their engagement with Christianity in different kinds of ways. And we will get to Long Island at different points along the way. But I want to get to Long Island by first stepping back and thinking about the bigger picture, because that might not be super familiar to some people who are on the call, and to think about the ways in which this history unfolded, and also to talk through some of the ways that I think about this as well. The way that I've written about it in this book, The Indian Great Awakening, is not the only way to think about it, but it's a way that I think makes sense to me in terms of reading the sources, but also talking with people like Sandy, although we weren't in conversation when I was writing this book, but people like Sandy, present day members of indigenous communities and nations who understand their own history and understand their own relationship to Christianity in certain kinds of ways. So let me start off with first some core considerations, maybe just to think about this. I don't know you know, what kinds of what level of knowledge people on the call in this meeting have about sort of this history of attempts to evangelize indigenous peoples by the English in New England. But I would say just a couple of things. I mean, I got into this when I was a graduate student at Harvard a long time ago, feels like a long time ago anyway. And I was trying to understand some of these early dynamics in the 17th century, everyone writes about the Puritans and the English colonists and stuff. And I wanted to know, what did this relationship look like long term, right? So a lot of people had written about John Eliot. I'll talk about him this morning, this missionary to Massachusetts indigenous nations. And yet not many people had written about what comes after that, like the 18th century, the 19th century. And indeed, if I feel like I tried to do this at the very end of the book to sort of reference the present and bring the story up to the present in a small way by recognizing the ongoing presence of all the different tribal nations that I was talking about in the book. That is really important in a way to recognize the continuity and the enduring present day presence for readers of my book. But actually, there's so much more that could have been told after my book. Sort of like the heart of it stops around 1820 and then picks it up again in the present, but there's so much, of course, that happens in between that time too. So there's a lot more to write and to understand about these histories, of course, and this is just one small part of the conversation. But what I was going to say here in terms of core considerations, there's a longer academic interest in Native European religious interactions, but it's weirdly skewed. Like it's almost like academics are drawn to moments where indigenous people embrace Christianity. And I don't know how to feel about that in a way, because on the one hand, that makes sense to me, because there are a lot of indigenous peoples who are Christian in some way today, but there's a lot that aren't, right? And so why is it that scholars, largely Anglo-European scholars, American scholars, want to focus on these moments where indigenous people embrace Christianity at some level, right? And in thinking through that, I think it's partly because it puts indigenous peoples historically into a box and a category that feels safe and understandable, right? And that's not a really great way to pursue scholarship or to think about these relationships. So in this book, I came to this topic with a question that was more indigenous centered, and trying to think about, what did these engagements with Christianity mean for the different kinds of tribal nations who were involved, for individuals? Why would any indigenous person want to engage Christianity at all? I mean, I put myself in the shoes of people in the 1740s. They've experienced 100 years, or 1640s even. By 1740, you've experienced 100 plus years of an invasive European English presence. You've had minister after minister attempts to evangelize, right? And it's not been a great experience, right? Settler colonialism is highly destructive, and there's been, wars and enslavements and attempts to convert. And so the question for me is, why would anyone in this time period who's not English and European embrace Christianity at all, right? It's really kind of an interesting question. So when you start from that perspective, then you have to ask yourself, well, what's the motivation? Why would people on Long Island or in New England or anywhere ever come to the place where they see Christianity as something that is worth adopting or engaging in some level? Anyway, so that's kind of the perspective of the book. And as I got into it, I think at the core of it, there are just different priorities for indigenous peoples and ministers. And that's kind of to state the obvious in a way, but even though sometimes they're speaking the same language, right? Let's say they do come together over questions of Christian theology or religious experience or something like that. Ministers are reading one thing into it in terms of their own framework of Christian theology and conversion, and indigenous leaders and individuals are reading their own set of ideas into it in really interesting ways. And so to me, that sort of is a part of what makes this a fascinating period of history. And so out of that, then, in the book, I suggest that this is just for me, but I'm suggesting that using the word conversion maybe is the wrong framework for understanding these religious engagements. And so I prefer to use the word affiliation in the book. Why? Well, because I think the word affiliation is less black and white and certain, and reflects the kinds of experiences that I was seeing. So indigenous people might come to a sermon of Azariah Horton on Long Island in the 1740s, for example, right? They might even join a local church, a white local church. And we can talk about why that might be the case. But they want something out of it, I think. Like they're looking for allies. They're looking for people who can help them with the core concerns of their community, which is often land, right? Political sovereignty, cultural sovereignty, maybe even education sometimes, to give their children, the next generation, some understanding of this world that is surrounding them, so that they can better defend communities and the values that are important to communities as well. So that's kind of the big picture for me is who, the questions I ask myself is like, what sources are we reading? What voices are we listening to? Whose perspectives are we privileging in this as well? And if we assume that what the missionaries do and say is the only story here, I think we kind of miss this really interesting other perspective that is vastly, in some ways, more important, about perspectives on religious engagement, perspectives on conversion, perspectives on values that far transcend Christian theology, right? So having said all that, though, what I don't want to do is to also say that no indigenous person cared about Christianity, because that's not true either. There's clearly a way in which a small percentage, I don't think it was ever the majority, but a small core of each indigenous community and tribal nation found something in Christianity that was meaningful to them, and that they made it their own in certain kinds of ways. They indigenized it, and they adapted parts of it that made sense and intertwined it with more traditional ways of thinking. And so this kind of hybrid indigenous Christianity that is both cultural and religious and theological and ritualistic all at the same time, I think is what emerges. So I hope that's helpful, just to step back and think big picture about this process. Here's a little maybe summary of this framework to think about affiliation and engagement versus conversion. And why? Well, because conversion we is more static. It's a colonizing framework, right? It's a European framework that's deeply rooted in Christian theology. Whereas religious engagement and affiliation, I think, reflects more what I see in the records, which is that indigenous people come, they're curious, they come, they listen to preachers, they might engage, they might even join churches, but it might not last for a lifetime. They might intertwine different ideas and beliefs of the people with other ideas too that are more traditional. But really what I was surprised is how many people in these tribal nations actually just reject Christianity over time, right? And that's a story that we haven't told enough, that I think is really helpful, because it defies the categories that scholars are more comfortable with in terms of a indigenous Christian people. So I'm just going to keep talking, I guess, for a while, and maybe we can have a Q&A at the end. But so write down your questions, keep them in front of you. So I just want to do a very quick kind of big picture survey of this process, 17th into the 18th century, if that's okay with you, just because I imagine that some people aren't familiar with this process. So again, thinking about the religious engagements, that's at the core of what we're talking about here, within settler colonialism, specifically within the English settler colonial context, and New England and Long Island indigenous peoples. So to start with, this idea of Europeans, and especially the English, coming in to evangelize indigenous people in New England more generally, and Long Island, is at the very founding of the Massachusetts Bay Company. The very charter says that the principal end of this plantation to win and incite the natives of the country to the knowledge and obedience of the only true God and Savior of mankind. And this is a famous seal of the Massachusetts Bay Company, right? This sort of like completely erroneous, parodied notion of an indigenous person standing with a bow and arrow saying, "Come over and help us," right? This is an English fantasy of what they imagine indigenous people to be doing and saying, which is not the case at all. And in fact, it doesn't happen very quickly or even much at all. It takes a while for indigenous people to be evangelized, for ministers to really pay specific attention to indigenous peoples. And in fact, before there's any evangelization, there's a genocidal war against the Pequots in the 1630s, right? So Boston's founded in 1630. Within 6 years, Boston and Rhode Island and Connecticut all team up to wipe out the Pequots entirely. And then in the 1640s, then they turn to evangelization. So that's a really important sort of part of the story as well. So John Eliot is the person who's most associated with the 17th century evangelization process. He's a minister at Roxbury, Massachusetts, and there's two different aspects of his missionary program that are important and actually cast a long shadow over the 18th century on Long Island as well, in important ways. The two main features are praying towns, which there aren't really any in Long Island, but the idea of having indigenous people be educated and sort of quote unquote adopt features of civilization is a really important part of the history on Long Island. And then also Indian language publications, so that there's an effort to produce in written Massachusetts or Wampanoag, depends who you talk to, catechisms, and then indeed the entire Bible, which I'll talk about in a second. So in terms of the praying towns, so-called, Eliot helps to found these praying towns. So you can see there's a whole cluster up here. And then there's a couple, they're all basically Massachusetts and northeastern Connecticut as well. Rhode Island doesn't have any. There's a whole separate process of praying towns and a different missionary that's involved on Martha's Vineyard and in what was Plymouth Colony before as well. So those are the praying towns. In terms of, well, there's more I could say, but the praying towns, some of them are, scholars have begun to get into this a little bit. Sometimes there's a land transactional part of things where, like, the Massachusetts government agrees to basically create a praying town to protect a land base in that praying town, but the people who do that have to give up land elsewhere in order to secure that land base. So it's some of them function as like quasi reservations, right? Because there's a land exchange as a part of that. Not all of them, but some of them. And also there's a little bit of kind of cultural coercion in there as well. There's rules that are passed in terms of who can do what and what kinds of indigenous practices you can do. And, indigenous people were encouraged to cut their hair and to stop speaking their own language. And so it's not quite as like coercive as the Indian boarding schools in the late 19th and 20th century, but there's an element of that, of basically like getting rid of indigenous practices and language in some of these praying towns. It's really coercive. And actually the Massachusetts government passes a series of laws in 1646 that says that they can't get drunk, they can't participate in powwows, they can't, lie, cheat, or steal, or have more than one wife, right? Or wear their hair long. So there's definitely a focus on kind of cultural aspects that is a part of this process. The second thing that Eliot does, again, which is important to think about how indigenous people engage with religious texts and biblical texts, is that Eliot's working with indigenous translators begins to translate sections of the Bible and catechisms and so forth, and eventually in 1663 translate the entire Bible for the first time anywhere in the Americas. Actually, the first printed translation of the entire Bible anywhere in the Americas, Spanish, French, Dutch, anywhere. Really quite an accomplishment, but with directly working with indigenous translators. Publishes this, and this gets used quite a lot. It is seen as both a symbol of English colonization and evangelization in a bad way, but also it's embraced by some Massachusetts and Wampanoag and Nipmuc Christian ministers as something that they sort of personalize. And so in terms of the rejection during King Philip's War, which I'll talk about in a second, some Native Americans take this Bible and they tear it apart, or they, in one instance, I think that they killed a cow and stuffed the Bible inside the cow, because these are like the two signs, the domesticated animals and this Bible, two signs of English colonization. But on the other hand, we have copies today of this Bible that exist in different libraries around the country. And in the margins are handwritten notes in Wampanoag or Massachusetts language by indigenous people as they're interacting with the text. And so there's signs of like engagement of the text itself, which I think is really fascinating. This is a better close-up in a way of the actual translation. And there's a lot more that could be said, because there's words, theological concepts in Christianity that don't have a reference point within indigenous life worlds and sort of religious worlds. And so the idea of hell, for example, doesn't really, there's no not quite the same analog in Massachusetts and Wampanoag and generally speaking, Northeastern Algonquian life worlds. And so the indigenous translators who are helping John Eliot have to come up with the phrase, and the phrase they use for hell, and this is based on Jesse Little-Daubaird's work, the phrase they use is walking around without your brain, because they believe that the soul resided in the brain. And so that's what hell would be, is like this disembodied sort of separation from your soul. So anyway, this is a really fascinating process. It's a whole another section of this. I just want to mention, you probably know this already, but Jesse Little-Daubairs, who's a master in Wampanoag, has been leading sort of language revitalization for Wampanoag. And I think there's a lot of other versions of this in other parts of New England. I'm less familiar with what's happening in Long Island, to be honest, but I imagine that's also the case for the Shinnecock and Montauk as well. And I know the Narragansetts that are doing the same thing. So one of the things that then happens that changes this a little bit, a lot actually, is this war that comes to be called King Philip's War. And I'm sure that most of you are familiar with this, but it's named after a Pokanoket leader in what is now Bristol, Rhode Island. And it comes on the heels of 50 plus years of an invasive English presence, right? And you have a lot of frustration, appropriately. There's land loss, there's a loss of political sovereignty, there's evangelization attempts. And so Metacomet, or King Philip, reaches this point where he no longer is willing to accept it. And so there's a sort of a wide-ranging number of indigenous people that join with him. They rise up against the English, again, I think very appropriately, because of the nature of colonization. It doesn't go well for them. Some of the Mohegans, Pequot, fight with the English. Some of the Christianized Wampanoags also fight with them as well. But it devastates the region, is really my point. There are dozens of indigenous towns that get destroyed. 25 native English towns get burned to the ground. There is a huge sort of like impulse to enslave all of not only the combatant indigenous people, but also the non-combatants. So there's about 1,000 that are enslaved locally in New England, and another 1,000 that are sent overseas at different places, even as far away as the Azores, Spain, Tangier, which is in North Africa. I found evidence of New England natives after King Philip's War being sent to Mexico, colonial Mexico as well, and sold as slaves. So there's this really violent sort of conflict, and out of it, the English victory doesn't do away with indigenous peoples at all. Long Island natives as well, but the Mohegans, Pequots, Narragansett, they all still remain. But it's the last sort of military uprising, I guess you could say, attempt to kick out the English through military means in this time period. It leads to erosion of land base. It leads to erosion of political autonomy and cultural autonomy and so forth. So that's an important context then for what happens later on in this time period. And there's some reports that come out of this time period too that try to understand, well, what happened to Native American Christianity in Massachusetts and what was Plymouth Colony after King Philip's War. And so this is a report from 1698 that found 30 indigenous congregations in eastern Massachusetts, but there were none on Rhode Island, Connecticut, or Long Island, or in Western Mass. At least this was the survey that was done by Missionary Society. So in the region that had been heavily evangelized, these congregations kind of turned inward, and they were self-running, they were autonomous. Sometimes they ran their own schools. They weren't really supervised by whites, but that whole 17th century impulse didn't really affect Long Island, didn't really affect a lot of Connecticut or Rhode Island as well. So that's where this book kind of focuses on, is in the 18th century, to think about how that changes. And so just again, to shift to the 18th century quickly, to think about this. So one of the ways to think about this is that there's basically European or English missionaries and pastors begin to realize after King Philip's War that they haven't done very much to reach out to Connecticut and Rhode Island and Long Island. And so there's an ongoing attempt to do this. So I refer to this in the book as a second wave of missionary attempts. So there's a company called the New England Company that was founded in 1649. There's a Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts that was founded in, I think, 1698. And there's a Scottish Society, the Moravians are present. So at the beginning of the 18th century, there's a whole lot more activity in terms of missionary societies, in terms of people, in terms of missionaries, who specifically then set their sights on these other groups of people who had not been evangelized in Connecticut and Rhode Island and Long Island. And what I think is interesting in this period in the early 18th century is that indigenous communities preferred education. They didn't really want missionaries or pastors on their lands, but they wanted their children to learn how to read and write English. And I think this is a very practical thing. You learn the tools of the colonizers so that you can defend yourself in court, so that you can write, so that you can read land deeds and documents that are put in front of you to sign, right? It's a way of protecting yourself in different kinds of ways. And it's interesting because Experience Mayhew, who's on Martha's Vineyard, comes through southern New England in the 17 teens, and he talks with different Mohegan and Pequot leaders. I don't think he goes down to Long Island at that point. But the one thing they say to him is they say, hey, look, you guys are sending your missionaries, you're sending your teachers, but you're also taking our land. Like that's not something that is sustainable. We have to deal with the land loss and the dispossession if you want to talk to us about Christianity. So I think that's a really interesting part of this process, in a way, is the way in which indigenous community leaders have their own sense of what is most important to them, and they communicate that. And actually, this goes the whole way up to the Connecticut governor. He recognized this. 1770, there's a proposed measures to sort of like basically bring Connecticut natives to civilization. But he basically says, look, the way to get them to embrace Christianity and, to become, to adopt English civilization is to deal with this land question, right? To have their tillage preserved from trespass is the likeliest way to put them in a circumstance in which they may more easily be prevailed with us as to the great design which is proposed of persuading them to receive the gospel. So it doesn't matter in a way, like if we really agree or disagree. My point here is even English leaders realized that like lands was a priority, that cultural autonomy and political sovereignty was important. And even though they didn't really accomplish that, they still recognized it. So this takes me to kind of the core of when things begin to change on Long Island, the core of when things begin to change elsewhere, Western Connecticut, actually Eastern Connecticut too, Western Massachusetts, Rhode Island. And it's during the First Great Awakening, which you might have heard something about over the years. So it's essentially a series of religious revivals, roughly in the 1730s through 1750s. So right at the middle of the 18th century. And they're really widespread. They take place in all over British North America, but also the Caribbean, England, parts of continental Europe. And essentially, it was sort of a widespread movement in a time of religious interest and activity. And you had ministers who were traveling around doing kind of very unusual things, like preaching out of doors, as we can see George Whitefield preaching here as well. So it's not just that you're preaching in churches, you're empowering people, lay people to preach, you're empowering women, and in North America and the Caribbean, enslaved people to preach and to take part and have religious experiences. And so scholars sometimes have overemphasized the interconnectedness and the widespread nature of it, but I do think it was an important moment that changed how indigenous people saw Christianity. So if you think about the 17th century, I don't know how many times you've heard descriptions, of Puritan sermons, but they were basically read and were like an hour and a half long, right? Like totally, I'm sounding biased, but sounds very boring to me, right? Like, why would you go submit yourself to that? Especially if you're an indigenous person. You come in, you have to sit like at the back of the church, and you have to dress like English people. You have to cut your hair. And then you sit in this hour and a half, 2 hour long service that you don't understand at all, right? There's very little attraction to English Christianity in the 17th century in some ways, right? 18th century is different. The First Great Awakening, you have people who come to reservations. You have people who come to indigenous people who preach mostly in English, but who encourage religious experimentation, who encourage sort of, fainting and falling, and a little bit more of a tactile, hands-on experience of Christianity that feels really different and new. And so indigenous peoples, they are attracted to ministers who are promoting this kind of experience. They get involved, they come to these outdoor services, they sometimes some of them become leaders within this movement themselves as well. And so I think that that's a really important part of thinking about this. The sort of people have talked about it as a democratized experience of Christianity, right, where anyone can have access to this kind of experience and quote unquote conversion experiences as well. And also, revival meetings were like noisy. They're outdoors. They last late into the night. Some scholars have talked about, maybe there's some sort of way in which like community dances and revival services, like for indigenous people and English people kind of overlapped in some ways. So this was an important part of this. And just, I already kind of said this already, but why did they take part in this? And I think that there's more emotive version, I said before. It's empowering, emphasis on personal experience and the Holy Spirit. And also they saw revivalist ministers as allies. I think that's a really important part. When Whitefield comes through, when Davenport comes through, Andrew Croswell, all these ministers who are kind of radical in their religiosity, they initially think, oh, these people are going to help us. They're going to help us in our struggle with regard to land. They're going to help us in our struggle with regard to education. They're going to help us in our struggle with regard to political autonomy. There'll be a connection for us. And that doesn't fully bear out, but I think that is part of this. We're not going to discuss this necessarily, but there's several accounts from the revival that point to some of these experiences and engagements. One person who becomes really important for Long Island, actually, is Sampson Occom, who has a published autobiographical narrative. And he essentially he grows up on the Mohegan Reservation. He experiences these English ministers coming into town, and he goes and hears them, and he finds himself drawn to their message. And he begins to adopt Christian practices and sort of, figure out how to incorporate this into his life. Later on, when he writes this autobiographical narrative, it's a really important thing to understand that he writes this defensively. So it happens, 2 or 3 decades after the events that he's describing. But basically, Occom grows in terms of importance and prominence and stature as a Christian Indian missionary and minister, gets sent to London to raise funds for this guy, Eliezer Wheelock, who has a school in Connecticut. Eventually, Wheelock takes that money and founds Dartmouth College, which really makes people upset. So especially Occom, who's really mad about this. But Occom in 1768 is being accused of not ever being truly Indian. And so he writes this narrative that says, look, I was born and raised in the Mohegan tribe. I was born and raised a heathen, is what he says. Which, he's trying to make himself seem as authentically Indian by what Europeans and English people expected, right? But the reality is he had a lot of exposure. Anyway, I'm getting too deep into the weeds here, but Occom becomes really important because he marries into Long Island family, and he actually serves for many years as a minister, as an educator on Long Island to Shinnecock and Montauk communities, and is a really important part of shaping their own sense of themselves and indigenizing educational practices in terms of indigenizing Christianity for a whole generation of Shinnecock and Montauk indigenous peoples as well. There's stories of him, and he tells this in his autobiographical narrative. If you haven't ever seen it, he tells these stories of educational methods that he pioneered, which was to take little pieces of bark and shingles and write letters of the alphabet on them, and then sort of display them to the different indigenous students that he had in his classes, which I think is really interesting too. So if you haven't read that, it's worth reading for sure, but know that he's writing it defensively and trying to really sharpen his religious journey in a way, if that makes sense. So one of the things that's really interesting, and I'll get to Azariah Horton in just a second here, but one of the things that's really interesting is that during the First Great Awakening, you have an initial burst of local natives, or natives who want to join local white churches. And again, this comes back to the puzzle that I mentioned at the beginning. Like, why would indigenous people, after a century of colonization, want to join a local white church? And again, I think it comes back to this idea that they saw this as a point of empowerment and connecting with people and experiences that might help their communities. But so one of the things I did for my first book is look through these church records. So this is an example from the North or Second Stonington Church in Connecticut. I think there's records probably on Long Island that have somewhat of the same. But here you have the minister who basically keeps track of who is joining the church. And you can see here, one day, June 16th, 1742, he says, "In this great and glorious day of grace was admitted to full communion," which is like to become a full member, in one day. June 16th, the following persons: 79 people joined this church in one day. And again, if you're a minister, this is like the peak of your career, right? This is amazing. What's important, though, is it's a part of those 89 persons were 4 people that are marked as Indian in the records itself. So he's keeping track of who's joining, and he's noting the presence of indigenous people that are joining the church too, which I think is really, really interesting. And so I was looking over different churches in New England, but for this graph, I focus on just the 3 congregational churches in Stonington because there's a lot of activity there. And again, I know this isn't Long Island, but the records for Stonington are richer in a way, which is why I think there's a parallel process happening in Long Island. We just don't always have the records for it to really show. But what you see here is you see the years down here, and then you see the different kinds of affiliations. This is black and white, unfortunately, so you can't see precisely. But basically, there's different ways that indigenous people affiliated with local churches, right? Baptism, membership, child baptism, or marriage. And there's a peak, a spike right at the height of the Great Awakening in New England. This is when Azariah Horton is making his rounds on Long Island. This is when Occom is experiencing inversion. This is when George Whitefield is coming through. Other ministers are coming through. And there's a spike. There's a number of people that join the church, just like we saw back here, join these 3 churches. But then I think this is what scholars have focused on, this spike, the few people that have written about this. They say, look, indigenous people joined the churches. What interested me more was how that doesn't last, right? So how do we interpret the drop-off of memberships of people joining the church. And that's what I wanted to really understand and write about. And so here, yes, Indigenous people join these churches, but they don't stay for long. I think that's really what I wanted to sort of puzzle over. So why did Indigenous people leave the church? And we have some evidence, some hints about this. Sometimes it was about the way they were treated. So even though you might go to these outdoor services and hear people speaking and preaching and feel empowered yourself, ultimately, when you join a church, you go back into a church building on a Sunday morning, and as a person of color, you're forced to sit in the back or the upper level of the church, right? So you're spatially sidelined in terms of the church experience, which is really different than being outdoors and just being among the people, right? But also, there's a lot of instances in where churches actually kick people out or excommunicate people for getting pregnant out of wedlock, or for continuing to attend powwows or something like that, right? So there's a way in which white churches kind of wanted to force natives into a certain kind of English Christianity as well, that they resisted. But also there's a way in which after the initial burst of the Great Awakening, churches kind of returned to normal. And so instead of these extemporaneous sermons outdoors and singing and dancing, whatever else, you went back into the church building and it was boring again. And so natives just left. And this is one really amazing example of this. So in the Stonington church records, and again, I'm mentioning Connecticut, Stonington, but there's parallel examples that we don't have as clear records of, but I know are happening on Long Island as well. So Sarah Putak is an Indigenous person. She joins a church in Stonington, North Stonington Church. But then in 1747, just a couple of years later, she is no longer attending, and she's a full member, and so she gets tracked down by the minister, and the minister says, "Hey, why aren't you coming to church anymore?" And she says, you see here it says Sarah Putak's reason. She said that the pastor denies God and others preach as they used to when I first went to meeting, but I can't come here, for God calls to go and hear others. Kind of an interesting window into sort of some of the reasons. And as it turns out, what is happening is Sarah Putak is joining a separate church, and it's a capital S, separate. So it's English churches who pulled out of local churches, and then sometimes Indigenous people pulled out of those separate churches as well. So Sarah Putak is going to another church because they're maintaining that revivalist sort of sentiment. But it's also interesting because another reason why Indigenous people left these white churches is because their core values, what they valued, wasn't being addressed. And it's often about land. So at the very same time that the First Great Awakening is happening, there's also the Mohegan land controversy, which is a 40-year process of trying to get to restore their land base that's being chipped away. It actually ends up going over to England. There's Mohegan representatives that go in the 1730s, and then eventually a tribunal in London decides against the Mohegans. But the Mohegans petition in 1745, and they are like, look, we received your ministers, we received the revival, we took part and everything else, and our lives are still really, really hard. Nothing has changed. And I think that's a really important part of why, even after partially adopting Christianity and showing receptivity to evangelization, Indigenous people felt burned. They felt aggrieved because nothing had changed. They were exceedingly distressed and impoverished and almost undone. And so this poverty that adopting Christianity didn't actually do anything for them. So what is interesting is that from the white, so just to give the big picture here, a small percentage of Indigenous people embraced the revivals and joined white churches. And then most of them left the white churches. Initially, they went to English separate churches sometimes, but then eventually they either left entirely or else started these separate Christian Indian churches, which I think is a really interesting part of this process as well. So indigenous people, and again, not the majority, almost never, but indigenous people who found something in Christianity that they wanted to continue, something important to them. They had a meaningful experience, but didn't like the racism and the unhelpfulness and the harm in a white English church. And so they create their own communities, their own churches. This happens on Long Island. This happens in Connecticut. This happens a lot of different places in New England. And so there's a native separate Christian movement that takes place that has indigenous people running the church, has indigenous people running the schools, and really outside of the control of whites, which is really interesting. One of the core places we see this is the Narragansett Indian Church. And there's other examples of this on Long Island too, which I'll talk about in just a second. But basically, Samuel Niles is the minister here who in the early 1740s gets involved in the First Great Awakening. He decides that he is not happy in a white church, and so he leaves and forms a congregation around him. He's a Narragansett leader. But what's interesting to me is that he actually was illiterate. He couldn't read. And when white missionaries would come to him and say, hey, how can you lead a church when you can't read? He would say, you guys read the Bible. I get my information straight from the Holy Spirit. And it was kind of like this amazing moment where he's like, you guys are, you're taking it second best, but I go straight to the Holy Spirit. So it's this incredible moment. And this congregation persists through the 18th century, different leadership, through the 19th century. And actually, the Narragansett petition for federal recognition in the 1970s and 1980s points to this very piece of land that the church is on to show tribal continuity over several centuries. And so actually this church and the church building, the land becomes really, really important for the ongoing survivance of the Narragansett community through the lens of the federal government, at least. And I have a PhD student, Kamoni Burke, who's Narragansett, who's doing a really wonderful dissertation around looking at 4 different communities in New England and the role of tribal church lands and the role of the churches themselves is providing that sort of core that leads to federal recognition. The problem, I think, is that we could talk about federal recognition, but it's a reimposition of sort of neo-colonial kind of requirements, right? Which is just insane and ridiculous. And so the fact that the federal government values that church and that land is another way in which it sort of is this continual feedback loop about privileging Christianity within indigenous communities. But the land is really the most important part, and it comes through the church, which is important. Another thing that what we see here too is the emergence of I want to talk about this for a second. Yeah, I guess I could. The emergence of indigenous missionaries, and we see this on Long Island. We see this in Connecticut. Some of them are sort of organically emerging, like Samuel Niles. Some of them attend Eliezer Wheelock School, Moore's Indian Charity School, which I think I mentioned just previously. It was founded in 1754 in the post-Great Awakening moment. Only lasts about a decade and a half before moving to New Hampshire and the founding of Dartmouth. But in the process, Wheelock actually educates a couple dozen indigenous individuals who then go serve as missionaries back to their own territories, their own lands, their own people. And some of them that he's focusing on are actually from New York, to the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois, the Six Nations in New York. But some of them also come from Long Island. Some of them come from other places as well. And Sampson Occom is an early Wheelock student, actually, before the schools officially opened. So this idea of having indigenous people doing the work of evangelization, doing the work of educating, doing the work of serving as ministers, I think is really actually quite fascinating. But so to focus on Long Island in this for a little bit, at the core of this, this time period, basically the 1740s, is a number of different people, but one of them that I think is worth lingering on for a moment is this person that Sandy mentioned earlier, Azariah Horton. So he's a Presbyterian minister. He's employed by the Society in Scotland for the Propagation of Christian Knowledge. He is really starts his itinerant ministering in 1741, just as the First Great Awakening is taking place. And he keeps a diary, a journal about this. And so in his journal, he says he sets out from Jamaica, New York, and Western Long Island. And he undertakes in 1741 a 2-month preaching tour among the different various communities of the Long Island. And his journal is I think, somewhat available. Some of it is in a 3-volume history of Long Island. That is pretty accessible as well. The originals are in various places too. But so he sets out on this 2-month preaching tour, specifically stopping at different indigenous communities on Long Island. And this is very common for ministers in the First Great Awakening. Somehow the idea of the revivals really prompted English missionaries and pastors to pay more attention to indigenous peoples after a very long time of not really paying attention to them in terms of religious evangelization and so forth. And again, there's a lot to say, which I've mentioned before, like it was a narrow interest, right? It wasn't like these English missionaries wanted to help them with their land or help them with political autonomy or sovereignty, right? It was a very narrow interest in their souls, in religion, and quote unquote English civilization. So Horton sets out, he stops first at Rockaway, where he found 30 or so indigenous people who were, as he says, willing to hear and ready to receive instruction. So he says he preached a sermon in which, and these are his terms, he says, he set before them the sin of their natures, that this exposed them to God's anger and eternal displeasure, and briefly to show them the way of reconciliation by Jesus Christ. I mean, he's just straight up like evangelizing them, right? But this is in the time of the First Great Awakening when people were outdoors. It's a little more free-flowing, and there seemed to have been some receptivity. So he continues on. He goes to East Hampton, and then on August 14th, he goes to the Montauk community at Nepec, roughly halfway between East Hampton and Montauk, which about 14 miles apart. So then he continues back and forth between Montauk, Nepec, East Hampton, Shinnecock, Sabonek, which is close to Southampton. I'm probably mispronouncing all these names. I'm sorry, I'm not from Long Island. But everywhere he goes, he exhorts any indigenous people he could find. He even he goes to them, which I think is a part of why these indigenous communities were open to him, right? He's not requiring them to come into the church, to an English church, to do it. He goes and he holds meetings out of doors. He goes and meets them in way-tos and wigwams and longhouses. And he does preach then in some English churches as well. So according to him, this is a pretty successful 2-month trip. He says that people come out to hear him. So more than 70 indigenous people come on August 23rd in his journal, he says, another 50 2 days later, 40 the next day on August 26th, with another 40 on the 27th. And so even though people preferred to come to him in larger meetings, Azariah Horton says that he also tried to visit individual houses. He went to their way-tos, as he says, from wigwam to wigwam, asking direct questions to individuals and families. And it was really invasive in a way, right? He goes into these wigwams and says, like, are you born again? Or, do you believe in the Trinity? Or do you believe in Jesus? I mean, it's really kind of like, or do you know how sinful you are, right? Like these really direct kinds of questions that are offensive and off-putting. But again, in this moment of the First Great Awakening, and maybe at this point in sort of the process of settler colonialism, there's an openness to this in a way, anyway. So he's back and forth. His own ministry lasts for about 10 years. But in that time, he takes pretty detailed notes in his journal, and he talks about these conversations. So in one particular instance, Horton met a woman, I don't think he gives her name, unfortunately, on August 14th, 1741, who basically, he says to her, are you saved? And she's like, yeah, here's my process and my journey. And he was surprised. And what that told him is that there had already been this process of other ministers, other English educators who had been on Long Island in this time period. Because she says to Horton, this is again his terms, but narrating her, Horton says that she at first felt a lively sense of her actual sins and bewailed them exceedingly. But then the Lord Jesus appeared to her exceedingly lovely, and that the load of guilt she felt before was now gone, and that she felt light, which is interesting. So he has these really detailed descriptions of people's religious journeys and experiences. And for ministers in the Great Awakening, that is exactly what they're looking for. They want people to feel a sense of their own guilt and shame, and then a release in terms of being accepted by Jesus and by being forgiven. So anyway, his journal's full of this, people being savingly converted, of being awakened, of being whatever else. There's I could go on and on about some of these little stories that he tells, which I think is really interesting. What's interesting to me too is that actually he in his journal says the eastern part of Long Island, so primarily the Montauks and Shinnecocks and other smaller bands around South Fork, some North Fork as well, were pretty receptive to him, but the western Long Island natives were not. And so he was trying to figure this out. And what I have come to understand about this in a way is that there was more sort of background work kind of being done over the course of the early 18th century in terms of educators and stuff like that took place, which I think made this a little bit different for the Montauk community and Shinnecock, I think, in a way. But there's also this question of how much English did the Montauks and Shinnecocks know at this time period? And there's one instance where a guy named Cyrus Charles, who later becomes a Montauk Indian minister, and later in his life, he is reflecting upon this minister who came and preached to them, named James Davenport. And Davenport couldn't speak the Montauk language. And many of the Montaukans were unable to understand his sermons. At least that's what he describes, this Montauk named Cyrus Charles. But Charles he says, nevertheless, and this is the phrase he uses, the Holy Ghost interpreted it to our hearts, which I think is kind of interesting. So it's I don't know what to make of that, but the question of who understands what, I think, is really interesting part of this. Anyway, I don't need to wrap up here soon. But let me just let me see. I don't know. There's too much to talk about, perhaps. Sampson Occom, I think, is a really interesting part of the whole process. As I said before, he eventually takes over where Horton leaves off. So Azariah Horton leaves in 1751, kind of abandons the mission, which is sort of strange. And then it from that moment on, the indigenous pastorships and the sort of evangelization process of missionaries and educators on Long Island shift to largely indigenous people. So Sampson Occom's not Montauk or Shinnecock, but he marries in to his wife Mary and is a long-term presence on Long Island from the early 1750s up until even the 1780s, 1790s, in terms of education, in terms of mentoring and raising up a next generation of leaders, which I think is really interesting. But Occom is also fascinating because he articulates a really fascinating sense of what it means to be an indigenous Christian for him. He tells this story because someone asked him at one point later in life, they say, how do you think about Christianity as an indigenous person? And he says, well, there's a story about an old Indian who has a knife with a handle, and he's using the knife and the blade breaks. And so instead of just replacing the knife, he takes another knife and straps the handles together and uses both together with the blade. And then that blade breaks. And then he straps another one on, and then another one. And eventually he has a knife that has 6 handles, but 1 blade. And in his mind, that was how he thought about sort of traditional and Christian practices, is he kind of like put them side by side without giving up any one of the other, right? Which I think is a really intriguing thing. And to me, this is symbolized in the Mohegan Church in Unclesville, Connecticut. At the front of the church, there's this eagle feather and a cross, and it's the simultaneity, I think, that is really powerful, even today, visually in the church, that represents sort of both Christianity and sort of a traditional way of understanding this. The big picture here is there's eventual dissatisfaction by indigenous communities in New England. They end up leaving a core of the Christian Indian community from Long Island, some from Long Island, some from Rhode Island, Connecticut, and parts of Massachusetts. And they end up moving west to Brothertown in upstate New York among the Haudenosaunee, or the Six Nations. And so there's a voluntary migration, a removal of sorts, to move to a different place, to be free from white encroachment, to be free from the kind of racism they experience, to be free to practice their version of Indian Christianity, which I think is quite fascinating. I want to touch just very briefly on back to Long Island, and then I promise I will wrap up, because there's a way in which this unfolds in important ways. And if, for those who are interested in pursuing this, there's a few names I could give you to kind of track down. But one of the most important ones is Paul Cuffee. So there's another Paul Cuffee that everyone knows, who's like the famous mariner and everything else. But this is a Paul Cuffee who takes on the leadership of a bunch of Long Island indigenous communities and churches after the initial Great Awakening. So he takes it on from Sampson Occom, from Peter John, from Cyrus Charles, the Fowler brothers. So Paul Cuffee is born on March 4th, 1757, near Wading River on Long Island. And Cuffee's mother was a member of the Indian Separate Church in Wading River, which was founded by her own father, the Indian minister, Peter John. So Paul Cuffee is already born into an Indian separate Christian community, which is really fascinating. He ends up getting bound out to Major Frederick Hudson, and this is Paul Cuffee. He labors as a farmer until the age of 21. He kind of has his own revolts as a teenager, gets involved with the wrong crowd and so forth. But then there's another series of revivals on Long Island in the late 1770s. And he sort of has a turnaround and comes to some sort of faith, and commits himself to following the footsteps of his grandfather, Peter John, and even Sampson Occom, and for the next 30 years or so provides local and regional religious leadership. Sort of like Samuel Niles at Narragansett, he doesn't have much formal education, but he was well beloved as an effective preacher and teacher. So he and his wife Hannah had several children, and their children become ministers of Indian congregations. Obadiah and Vincent are their names. Obadiah served at Puspatuck, and Vincent served at Shinnecock. So there's a lot that could be said. Paul Cuffee eventually finds his way into white missionary societies and institutions in terms of ordination. The New York Missionary Society eventually supports him and supports his large family. But really the key here is that for 30 or so years, he was this roving minister, indigenous minister of different churches, especially 4 different churches at Islip, Puspatuck, Cold Spring, and Montauk, with a total of 63 communicants at these places. And he was a part of building the infrastructure of different kinds of religious and cultural events. He founded something called June Meeting or June Sunday, which was an annual meeting of the church designed to celebrate communion. And so there's a sense of presence, of durability, of cultural durability. So he dies on in March of 1812. He's buried at the Shinnecock Indian Church at Canoe Place, marked with a gravestone and a short epitaph that summarizes his life. And the epitaph says, erected by the New York Missionary Society in memory of the Reverend Paul Cuffee, an Indian of the Shinnecock tribe who was employed by that society. And it talks about all the different congregations that he ministered to. Anyway, I probably have gone way too long, and I apologize for that. I hope that this has been helpful to think in a big picture way about how to understand religious engagements, at least through my perspective and the sources that I've read and conversations I've had with people today, to think about how this series of religious engagements played out over time. How to understand these wide spectrum of engagements and responses, this emergence of an indigenized Christianity. But again, I want to really place an emphasis on that this was not universal. In every community that there was an Indian church, Christian Indian church, there was also a much larger group that was not a part of that church, right? So how do we balance that interpretively and historically, I think is really interesting. And also keeping this idea of indigenous people having their own concerns was really important. And getting beyond a simplistic conversion mindset is also part of it too. So thank you very much for your time. I would love to have a conversation about this, and I will turn it back over to our moderators to moderate the discussion.
Okay, this is Sandy again. I have someone that texts me a question, but before I go to Barbara Grimes, and then I think Robert raised his hand, I just wanted to mention when you were talking about Horton, because there are a lot of people on that are connected to where he stopped in Jerusalem, which is now Montauk, and he also stopped in West Neck, which is now Amityville. And he also stopped in Connecticut, which is now New York State Connecticut Park. So I just wanted to mention that. But Barbara, she's traveling, she's on the road. So if you can unmute and ask your question. Are you out there, Barbara?
Hi, Sandy and Linford. Thank you so much. I just had a question about the praying towns. What was the motivation for Native Americans to join the praying towns, or was it coerced in any way?
Yeah, it's a really good question. There is not at all the same level of overt coercion that you would find with post King Philip's War reservation systems, not at least initially. After King Philip's War, they do become mini reservations where basically the 14 in Massachusetts and Northern Connecticut are reduced to 4. And the Massachusetts authorities basically force people to relocate to them, not all of them, but a good number of them, and place restrictions on their mobility and so forth. So after the war, it does become more in that vein. Before the war, there's a number of things. Some scholars have pointed to the immense challenges posed by settler colonialism. So the English come in and there's diseases that are rampant, sort of the fearfulness of the Pequot War, the genocide of the Pequot people, or attempted genocide, because they still persist, obviously. And I use that word genocide very intentionally because there's a treaty after the Pequot War in 1638 when the Pequots are forced to sign a treaty that says that they will no longer use the word Pequot to call themselves Pequot, which is like an attempt to erase the very name of Pequot, which is really important. But so when you then, after the Pequot War, you hit the 1640s, I think some indigenous smaller bands in Massachusetts look around and they say, what are our options here? We can't rise up, right? We can't just simply move or relocate. These are our homelands. And so for some people, they see a praying town as a way to secure a land base and a way of seeking protection from the English. and there's actually a series of submissions directly to the king to become subjects of the king that would maybe encourage local leaders to treat them better somehow if they're like somewhat equal before the king in terms of that protection. So, but then I also want to leave room somewhere for somewhat genuine interest in Christianity. I don't know. Who am I to say that that's not a part of it? My interpretation veers on the sort of like more pragmatic side of things. I fully recognize, but people are humans with souls and sort of ideas about the afterlife and about the world around them and trying to make sense and meaning of it. And so I think that it's a complicated situation, but I hope that helps a little bit in terms of motivations.
Yes, thank you so much. And thanks for the presentation. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Robert, you want to ask your question?
Yes. Thank you. First, I just want to start with thanking you, Dr. Fisher, for your scholarship and just share my story. After reading your book, The Indian Great Awakening, you had mentioned ancestors of mine, Frederick Bosemides and Fanny Daniels, and it sort of spurred an entire research on my own and delving into this topic. And it's so fascinating, and I'm very grateful for it. And just want to reflect on one of the things I think, my interest was really to understand the indigenous experience, but the Christianity aspect and the evangelical aspect has created such a record that's what I look at, and that's I'm grateful from a scholarship point of view. I'm able to do a lot of research on that, but it's less the interest in the Christianity and just the fact that they kept the records. So again, thank you for your work, and I'm really appreciative of that. I think it adds so much value to something that's been wiped out, unfortunately.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you sharing that. That means a lot to me, and I do think that you're right. There's an irony there in a way, in terms of like this process that was really an attempt to sort of like eradicate and suppress traditional practices and stuff like that, that then leaves this record that allows us to connect families and networks and stuff. And the same is true with language. I mean, what Jesse Little Dobert is doing is resurrecting a language or revitalizing a language based upon colonial documents, right? That Indian Bible, the Massachusetts Wampanoag Indian Bible, is full of the whole semantic range of verbs and nouns and everything that I don't know that a full revitalization would be possible without it. So ironically, the very process that was, as you were just saying, intended to sort of suppress and alter and change is a part of revitalizing, which I think is really amazing. So yeah, thank you for sharing.
And we have another question. My cousin Philip, who's Montauk, put a long message in the chat. But Philip, are you still on? If you could unmute and ask your question. Well, I'll try to get Philip. Okay, I'll try to read it. He thanks you for the great presentation this morning. And during your research, did you ever come across any English thought about just allowing indigenous customs and norms? Let's see. I'm trying to scroll and not down, and it's not moving. Including spiritual thoughts and learning to live with them as they were, or was this concept just?
I can read it too if you want, Sandy.
Yeah, because I kind of froze. It kind of froze on me there.
So the question is a really good one. Basically asking, was there any way that the missionaries could ever have conceived of allowing indigenous peoples to just continue to be indigenous in their traditional practices and customs and norms, like without ever trying to convert them? And it depends who you asked, I think. I think that there was a sense of leniency on the part, and I use that word from their perspective, from missionaries' perspective, of leniency that emerges over time. And there's a little bit of a controversy in the field in terms of interpreting this. My own view is that initially there's a sense of like, we have to change everything about indigenous peoples to make them fully English Christians and sort of fully civilized by English standards. And then by the time you get to the 18th century, it is focused more on the interior process, I think, and a little bit less on the cultural kinds of things. And yet I don't really think that there's ever a point when people, even in the 19th century, where Americans by that point say, oh, Native Americans, that's fine, we just need to support them and who they are and everything else. No, it's like the whole, as you know, the whole history of like, you know, the American West and what the American government is doing, the wars against the Navajo or the Apache or whatever else. I mean, all these plains tribes and Southwestern tribes and the California tribes, putting them on reservations. It's all of that is an attempt to make them conform to American and European notions of what Indians should be, and changing gender norms and changing agricultural work that they're doing, and stop hunting buffalo and start planting, you know, potatoes and this other stuff, right? So I don't know. Specifically in the records I was looking at, even though there might be nuances in terms of how people view it, like I think the English colonial mentality is that indigenous people, to be fully incorporated into society and to be viewed as acceptable, had to become more English and more Christian and less indigenous. And that's a really, really hard reality, I think, from what I've seen anyway, that I don't know how to get around that. I think we see that today too. I think that mentality persists in the federal recognition processes and what's imposed on people, and trying to get people to be and present themselves and narrate their own histories in certain kinds of ways, and fulfill certain sort of white American notions of what Indianness is, even in a performative way, I think is really ongoing. So yeah.
Oh, Linford, first, Cynthia, you have a question, and after Cynthia, Two Feathers, you can ask your question.
Okay, thank you, Sandy, and thank you, Linford. I find this just fascinating as you reframe the conversion into the missionary and white churches as affiliation. And having an English literature background, we know how strong words are. As a matter of fact, our next program is about words, but it opens the possibilities for reinterpretation, as you are doing. And it struck me as I was listening to you, and you asked why, you know, why are they affiliating? And one of my thoughts was, when I think about the past and present political movements, I've heard that there are many of them are grievance-based, meaning people, you know, latch on to a very strong dynamic leader because that leader is promising something new or different for them based on whatever particular grievance they have. So I thought it was very interesting that you went on to say that part of the affiliation and the interest of the Native Americans was to talk about land and was to talk about their problems, and yet that never really happened. So I just wanted to add that you know, the word grievance kind of fits into some of the words that you're talking about when reframing. And I think this is excellent. I think this is an excellent stance for you to take and, you know, explore how this happens, as you did in today's lecture. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I appreciate that, the introduction of the idea of a grievance-based affiliation or engagement. That really fits. I think it really maps on quite well. So thank you.
And Two Feathers, can you unmute?
Yeah. Good morning.
Good morning.
I had just a couple of questions. I have wanted to know, did anyone ever document any of Samuel Niles' teachings and his sermons? Because he is a direct ancestor of mine, particularly a grandfather. And did you know of any other praying Indian villages in New England besides the ones that are mentioned in Massachusetts? Are there any others like in Connecticut or New York?
So, well, first of all, in Samuel Niles, there's I think the best source that might get you there is a book compiled by William Simmons called, I think it's Old Lights on Separate Paths is the name of it, but it's basically a publication of Joseph Park's missionary and educational journeys, and I think he has a lot of encounters with Samuel Niles, and that's where some of the information comes from. I don't know that it's as well documented as what you're looking for in terms of the actual content and everything else, but that might, if you haven't seen that book, I think that might be a nice lead in that direction. And if you want to email me later, I could try to send you some references from the book as well. Or if you have my book, the footnotes should contain some places that would lead you more towards more information about him, some of the content and so forth. But really, there's only these snippets. Mostly we get these little snippets, like what I said before. He's relying directly on the Holy Spirit, and we don't have sermons that survive, for example. We don't have letters, of course, non-literate. But I really have come to see him, along with, someone like Paul Cuffee too, as these incredibly savvy and self-aware and dedicated community leaders who are fulfilling what I interpret as sort of traditional roles, but using, like, overlaying that on top of sort of Christian Indian leadership as well, which is really fascinating. And so, and I don't think this is unusual at all in Indigenous communities, where community leaders use those positions to work on behalf of the community at different levels, right? And this is exactly what he's doing. He's out there in the realm of politics, and he's advocating for the Narragansetts. He's ministering to the church, and he's fulfilling all these different roles, and he's a community builder and organizer. And so I have all kinds of admiration for him and for other people like him, like Paul Cuffee, Sampson Occom. It's complicated though, right? Because it's a specific choice to sort of use that specific venue to accomplish those goals. In terms of other praying towns, so as I think I mentioned very briefly, Plymouth Colony, which later becomes Massachusetts, on that southern shore, and then Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard, there are maybe up to half a dozen to a dozen praying towns, so-called, that persist. And even after King Philip's War, Southern Mass, Mashpee, and Martha's Vineyard all retain these praying towns, but they're a little bit different because there's not quite the sort of land exchange for any one of these, as far as I'm aware of. But they do become these nodes of Indigenous education, Christianity, and so forth. The other one to mention too is Stockbridge, Massachusetts, in Western Mass is a really important one too. There's another one, the Pashkokoke, the Scotticoke community in Western Connecticut has like versions of this a little bit too. The Moravians are there, and there's attempts by the English to sort of do that. And then, of course, the brother town itself in upstate New York is essentially functionally like a praying town, but a fully self-directed Indigenous Christian community. Long Island, I have not come across anything that resembles that, except that, Azariah Horton, Paul Cuffee, there are clearly these bands and nodes, but I have not seen any indication that that is orchestrated by the colonial governments, if that makes sense. And that's the key difference in a way. The praying towns in Massachusetts are something that it's like this missionary governmental kind of imposition versus a self-collected community. So that seems pretty different.
Yeah, I haven't found any either. Yep. Thank you. Any other questions before I turn it over to Cynthia. But I did want to mention another thing. With Occom, he actually married a Montauk woman. And but some of you, if you hang around for a few minutes after we close the presentation and stuff, I'll go back to the photos and you'll see some of her direct descendants.
That's
Cynthia,
fantastic.
Yeah, and thank you.
Okay. Yes, I want to thank you very much, Dr. Linford Fisher, for joining us today. It was wonderful. And if we can all unmute ourselves or hold our hands up and have a round of applause to show how grateful we are. I certainly found this very enlightening. And I would like to say, in preparation for our next class, okay, in preparation for our next class, which is on the power of words, the Algonquin language, again, Linford, you know, your two comments about conversion versus affiliation. One of the homework I was going to ask our subscribers, our participants today, and Nancy's going to follow up with an email, is to talk about the Native American land names on Long Island that we've kept. And I'm saying this so we became more aware, because until we started this series, it didn't really occur to me that Occom, you know, was Native American. I just took it. I, you know, came here 20 years ago and I just took it for granted. So I'm asking the people who are here today, many of you probably already know this, but to keep your eyes and ears open for, you know, Native American names, anything on the land, the rivers, the streams that we've kept. And then as I was getting ready to announce this, it also made me think about how then the white culture has become affiliated with the Native American. And do we call that, some people call it appropriation. And perhaps if we call it affiliation, it might go again more towards opening up the conversation for tolerance and true affiliation. So thank you. I mean, this has really, really opened up my eyes as far as the words go in your presentation about, you know, the community collaboration and involvement. So thank you very much. It was just wonderful.
Thank you for having me. This was really, really delightful, and I'm glad to have the chance to be here. And thanks for the great questions too. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
And I'd like to thank everyone. Our next session is November 18th. And
at 10 o'clock.
And I'm going to go back to the photos if people want to take a look at them. And thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
These are just some of the photos of ancestors that I have asked to join us today. And in this picture that's up there, everyone on this picture is related to a Fowler, or they are a Fowler. Whoops, and I'm going to say thank you and sign off.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Really nice to see you. Happy Saturday.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Fisher.
Take care.
Bye-bye.